happen, but remember, you've got to be funky.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to this week's podcast, Between the Lanes. And so excited to have you back. Thank you for being with us. And whether you're listening or you're watching, we're honored that you're here and excited to have another week. I am super excited to introduce you to many of you who watch this probably already know this guy. But if you don't know him, you are going to be super excited to know Mr. Chris Griffin. So welcome to you, brother.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you. Glad to be here.
What I realize is as you are watching, especially if you're watching, if you're listening, you have no context of this. But if you're watching, Chris and I look a lot alike. Now, what that means is very handsome.
Yeah. Yes, you are a great looking guy.
Listen, every time I see you.
Don't you think? Y'all think that, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
Every time I see this guy, I'm like, why does he look so good? He is just a good-looking guy. And so we've got a lot of similarities. Now, he's got these bright blue eyes. I've got sort of whatever brown eyes, but the head is the same. We've got this nice silvery touch in our beards and goatees. Anyway, so you're going to go back and forth and see the two of us, and there's a lot of similarities. So
I'm just glad I wore a different color shirt this time.
I almost went and got my shirt to match you.
We've matched before.
We have matched before, and it's confusing. And maybe this is actually good for people to see because I know sometimes whenever I'm out, I get, hey, Chris. And every once in a while you're out, you might get a, hey, Todd. And now people know
just
we're
this past
different.
Weekend, again. It keeps happening.
Now people will know we're different.
We're now, they can say we've actually been in the same room.
In the same room together. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Exactly. Well, look, there is a ton I want to talk to Chris about, but I want to get to know you for just a second. And let me explain to people why you're here, why you're a guest, what fascinates me about you. So Chris is multiple things. He occupies many different lanes in his life. Mm-hmm. But two that are fascinating to me is that he is the CEO of Hover Energy. He'll tell you a little bit more about that. He is also the men's pastor for Gateway Church. Now, there are a lot of different men's pastors across different campuses at Gateway Church. But Chris is the central men's pastor. So how can you have a leadership and a ministry role in a church like Gateway Church in the capacity that Chris has that, and be the CEO of a multinational organization? And it's fascinated me as long as I've known Chris, and built within all of that is a father and a husband, and clearly a man of great faith. So there's a lot to learn from Chris. I want to peel back the layers a little bit on this international man of mystery. That's who you are. But we got to get to know you first. So talk a little bit about your, how are you where you are today? What is the journey of faith? What's your journey of interest and energy? I mean, I want to plug for sure Hover Energy and talk about that, but I really want to talk about you and what's inside of you. But we got to get a little bit of context to all that. So start from the beginning. It's a very good place to start.
Well, if we go all the way back, we could be here a long time. But I would say that how did I get to this point? There are days I look back and I honestly say I have no idea. I really do. It's remarkable to me. I can remember, and somebody brought this up to me just last week. I can remember a series of sort of markers in my life where things were either going to become really great or go sideways really bad. And those moments tend to stand out more. Mm-hmm. So when I think of my history, I remember these sort of series of moments. But a little bit about me. I mean, I grew up in a broken home. You know, my mom, my dad left 2 weeks before I was born. Wow. 2 weeks.
Wow.
And so I didn't know him till I was 12. I know him today, and I got to know him when I was 12, and then I've got to know him a lot better as I got older. And I love him, and I love him today. We've sort of reconciled, but he wasn't there in the early stages of my life, and even when I was a teenager, I didn't really get to know him. And it wasn't until I met my Heavenly Father that I realized what a gap was there. Wow. What an empty space that I didn't know was an empty space, right? And so I'm eternally grateful for when I got to meet my Heavenly Father.
When did that happen?
Which didn't happen until I was 37.
37.
And I'm 54 now.
Okay.
So 17 years that I've known the Lord. And I think but between when my father left or when I realized that he wasn't there, I didn't even know he wasn't
Yeah, you
I
had no
really,
context otherwise.
I really had an excellent stepfather who was around.
Oh, you did have a
and
stepfather.
And
okay.
he came into the picture. I didn't know he wasn't my father until you start to ask those questions.
Yeah.
How come we have different names? Stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. But he was a good man. Not somebody who was chasing after the Lord, but he just was a good person. And he really believed in doing the next right thing all the time.
Yeah.
And so that was a good kind of mantra I remember growing up with.
When you think about, let me ask you real quick, because
Yeah.
you talked about those markers, and I like that thought.
Yeah.
When you think about that, birth to 12, and you find out about your birth father, but kind of in those teenage years, I mean, can you identify one of those markers that you go, yeah, here's some very key moments in my life, and this, maybe it was 12 with finding out, or was there another moment kind of in those early years that helped shape you?
Yeah, it's a great question. I remember there's one marker that I loved and was really impactful on me for a really long time, where when I was 17, I was just finishing high school, or the year before I finished high school. So I was going into my senior year of high school, and I realized I worked in the restaurant business. I've been a cook for a long time. Started out as a dishwasher when I was like 13, and then I worked as a cook and for years and years, and so much so that when I went to college, I acted as a sous chef in a restaurant there for the first 3 years of college, and so I really kind of loved that part of my life, but I wanted to get away from working in the restaurant business, and so going into my senior year, I got a job in construction. And I went to work for this real estate developer who I just thought was the coolest guy I'd ever seen, right? The guy flew planes, he wrote poetry, he was like a professional tennis player, and he was building, 60, 70 buildings all around the Metroplex.
A true Renaissance man.
Exactly right. In fact, there was an article in the local newspaper that called him a Renaissance man.
What?
Yes, that was prophetic. And so he literally said, they called him Renaissance man. There's a big picture of him and all these things he did, picture of playing his book, all this stuff. And I remember thinking, I want to be like that guy. And I remember thinking it, and I'm 17, and I'm going into my senior year. And so I'm in this construction job for about a month. And he claimed in the business that he had this open door policy. Now, there are about 100 people working for him. And he had this open door policy. So I went up to his office one day after we were done with the construction day. Of course, he was always there later than anybody else. And so I sat outside the office and I waited and told his admin I'd love to speak to him. And he agrees to see me. So I go walking into his office and he says, "Well, Chris, I hear you're working really hard. What can I do for you?" And I said, "I want to do what you do." And he goes, "Oh, you do you?" And I said, "Yep, I want to learn everything about what you do, and I want to do it the way you do it because I love the business you've built here." And he looked at me like kind of surprised, and he said, "Why don't you have a seat?" Wow. And he welcomed me into that discussion, and for the rest of the summer, I worked with him as much as the construction manager would let me because there was work to be done there. And then the next summer, I went to work for him full time. Wow. And I did that every summer during college. Wow. Until I graduated. And it was that one moment of walking into his office and just telling him how I felt exactly and I was very transparent. I'm like, "I have no idea how you do this, but I want to do what you do." Wow. And he said, and he welcomed me in to do that. And so he was very influential. Yeah.
Before you go on to the next thing, because I want to comment on something there, because one of the things that people need to know about you. So as a men's pastor, I'll ask you to tell. You had a goal. You started at a campus, being a men's pastor at a campus, and as a heart for men, you're like, I've got to get to know men. Well, Gateway is a big church, a lot of people. You endeavored to figure that out of how to get to know men. Yeah. By what strategy? And I want to tie it back to the example you just gave, but
and it does. So I'm glad you.
Okay, so give what your strategy was. There.
Yeah. So my strategy was to sit down and have coffee with every man that I could possibly meet. The way I originally thought about it was kind of like taking inventory, right? You got to know what you're working with before you can decide how the Lord wants to minister to them, which applies to business too, by the way. But when they invited me to be the men's pastor, you remember those days at that campus, that was the first question that came to mind. The first thought was, how am I going to possibly speak to the 1,700 men who go to this campus? And how do I get to know what the Lord wants for them? And he made it very clear to me. He said, go sit down and ask him. So I started on this mission to meet. There were 1,776 men on that roster at the time. And the first day that they set me in, I stood up with the microphone, and the first time they ever handed me the microphone, I said, I'm going to sit down with every single one of you. Here's my cell phone number. Call me and let's have a cup of coffee.
And when you endeavored to do that, you were still at that point a CEO of an organization. So you're trying to do that. And so I think from a leadership standpoint, many leaders would think about that task and go, that is not scalable. That is not possible. I'm one person. How am I going to do that? What strikes me about you is when obstacles have come your way, you seek obedience first, not how is that going to happen or what are the roadblocks I got to get past in this? You obey. How did you work through what could be a seemingly insurmountable, or certainly from a time frame standpoint? Because talk about completing that task and how long it took.
Oh yeah, no, it took 6 years to do it, but. And I did do it. I mean, I got through it. I'm still doing it today, but it's not the same group, right? Yeah. And I don't intend to try to do it all by myself, but I do think a great leader ought to lead by example. And if I wasn't willing to sit down with every single man, how could I possibly ask somebody else to? Yeah. And it goes for everything I think I've ever done. I felt like that is a leadership quality that has to be there, and it's one that most men are willing to follow when they see someone else is willing to do it. You hear it in sports, you hear it in families, you hear it just about in every context. And so for me, that was not a hard thing to start. And once it got going, you quickly realize that this was not my goal. This was his goal. And not only was it his goal, but I'm the one getting blessed by this, right? Yep. When you sit down and have a conversation with someone, I think the challenge I saw kind of in the Big C church is too many pastors and people who would engage with volunteers as soon as you started talking to someone, you'd ask them to do something. And the moment you start asking someone to do something, you've just revealed that you've got an agenda. So one of the number one things, the tenets that I made sure I never did, and then since then have passed it on to everybody else, is if you're going to sit down and have coffee with someone, you must not bring an agenda. You should just listen. Yeah. Right. Listening is maybe the best leadership quality you could possibly have, and you will learn a lot more if you're listening than if you're talking. So if I'm asking someone to do something, they already think that's why I'm here. I came here so that you could ask me to be part of some team to go do something somewhere. And, frankly, men have seen and been down that road before. They've seen that movie and they said this is the same old. I don't want to go this again. So I can't tell you how many times I walked away from those meetings where somebody would be like, well, you don't want me to do anything? I'm like, no, just wanted to get to know you. And so foreign to most people, right? and when thinking about the idea, and really what you were doing in that, you were building relationship. Yeah. And not that this was your motivation, but I think what you knew is, as I build relationship with people, it's going to be like stirring the soil of their heart. They're going to want to be activated and get involved because that's part of discipleship. Yeah. Discipleship is growth. And part of growing is me doing something beyond myself. But all of that began not because that motivated you day one. What motivated you day one was relationship. Absolutely. And now go back to the story that here's a guy who runs a business and he sees a young guy. I'm thinking, here's a 17-year-old, 18, whatever you were at the time, before senior year. Yeah. And this guy who ran a large business, 100 plus employees, took a moment to sit down with you. And I'm looking at that going, yeah, what a pivotal moment in knowing who you are today, to go back to go, that guy, was he a believer? He was Jewish.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if he was Messianic.
Yeah, okay. Well, there was something in him that saw the opportunity to sow into a young person. And I got to believe that guy had some margin in his life, because if you don't have any margin, you're not going to have the time to take an interruption. Yeah. Let's be honest. You were an interruption.
For sure. Yeah, you can, like intentionally.
And yet something dropped in his spirit, the Spirit of God saying, listen, I got a big plan for this kid. Yeah. But I need you to impart into him. And that's fascinating.
Well, and you know, his initial reaction when I said that, he said, "Please have a seat." And while I sat down, he goes, "There's a fire in your belly. I like you." Right. And, you know, for someone who grew up without a dad, to hear that from a very influential man who's, you know, in the newspaper, it was very affirming. And it was really edifying in that moment. And immediately I liked him. You know, just because he took the time to spend some time with me, to talk to me and to encourage me. And I think that model is very similar to what, you know, to what I then spent this time with all these other men. I just wanted to encourage them. Right. You know, you're not here by accident. Let's talk about what that looks like. And I think, you know, even to this day, I would argue that in my business and even with vendors that we talk to and clients that we talk to, the model is not that different. I mean, as it was with every man. And that is, I can't help you until I get to know you. And I want to help. Like I think I'm just wired to want to help. And how can I serve? How can I help? How can I be of service? How can I make an impact that's valuable in some way? And it's not just what I feel makes sense. It's I need a better sense of what really makes sense to this person. What's going on in their life that I might be able to help with? And I can't tell you how many people I got introduced to who didn't have dads growing up. And I immediately had the ability to say, well, hey, I know exactly what's going on here. I went through that same thing myself. Let's talk about that. You know, what happened in your situation? And just men being able to share what they missed out on was healing for them. And so you saw, you know, you'd see men growing, and we were just talking. But you'd hit at the heart of the matter. And it wasn't surface level. It was, let's figure out what's really going on. You know, what's going on in your life, and let me hear about it.
So you grew up in a broken home. And I'm going to assume that then based on that, there's a brokenness that's present in you. But you got a fire in your belly, introduces you to this guy. Fast forward then, or maybe some other pivotal moments that were part of tying that brokenness, because, you know, when I look at who you are today, I see a complete, a whole person. How did you go from that brokenness? What motivated you to Jesus? And then what did he do to heal that brokenness?
Well, that's a good one. I would immediately start with my mother. Okay. Because even though there was brokenness, I had no idea there was brokenness until I really knew there was brokenness, right? We had such a happy home when I was growing up, and
doesn't surprise me, because if anyone who knows you, you're just a joyful guy. You're fun to be around.
We laughed a lot, and when I send notes to people, even people that are customers and friends, I suggest that they laugh a lot this weekend. There's a lot of joy in my life still to this day, but it started with my mother. She was extremely joyful, like always laughing, always. Wow. There was always some teasing fun going on, and that's kind of how I still am. Like I've always been like that. So that's never changed. And I think, you know, that the way the Lord gifted my mother has poured into me. He gave her joy that has been you know, a cornerstone of my life. And, you know, it wasn't until I met the Lord that I realized that the joy of the Lord is actually my strength, right? But I didn't recognize that as a strength before. I thought I was just happy. Right? But happy and joy are a little bit different. And so, you know, it's a little deeper. So it started with her, you know, without going into my entire salvation story, because that could take a while. The short answer is I went through a series of really challenging relationships. And, you know, surprise, surprise, it was with with women, right? And so I had a relationship that didn't work. I had another relationship that didn't work. And I started to question me. Like, is there something wrong with me? The answer is yes. In fact, the answer is still yes. But the answer was yes then. And it wasn't until I felt like I was really broken that the business, I always seemed to do pretty well in business. And that was going well. And all of a sudden, that wasn't going so well one day. So that wasn't going well. My relationships weren't going well. And I was just at a point in my life where I felt like, wow, I can't believe I'm in my mid-30s and things are actually feeling like they're crumbling around me. Wow. How did that happen? I thought I was a happy guy. I'm the joyful one, right? And so I at that time, I had a really miserable moment in one of relationships. And I was getting on a plane coming back from Florida, from Orlando, And I'm sitting on the plane. This guy comes up to me, and he sees that I'm upset. And he touches me on the shoulder, and he says, "Hey, it's going to be all right."
It's out of nowhere.
And out of nowhere. And like when someone touches your shoulder on the plane, like you're like, you know,
exactly.
I wanted to like, don't touch me. Like, don't get away.
Yeah.
And yet I looked at him and I felt better. And I realized that things were going to be better. And I'm like, what just happened there? And so after in that moment, I wondered, why do I suddenly feel better? So we get up into the air and we're flying, and I go look for the guy, and I can't find him.
What?
And I never found him.
Never found him.
Got off the plane first because I had flown a lot, so I was near the front. And I stood at the end until the pilots came off, and he never came off the plane.
Wow.
But from that moment to this moment right now, I can't get enough of the Word of God.
Wow.
And it's been like that ever since that day.
Wow.
On October 16th. So
wow.
So yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was that moment that changed my life.
Yeah.
I would argue that was Jesus, whether it's an angel of the Lord or whatever you say. You won't convince me that moment didn't change my life, because it did.
It did.
And it was all of a sudden I started to get fulfilled with all these things that I didn't realize I was not filled with.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Well, that's what I was going to say. So in these broken relationships that happen, when you're in a place of brokenness, you don't really know what you're searching for. You don't know that you're searching. You go through and you have a series of broken events in your life. So you have these broken relationships, and you have this moment with the Lord. What was revealed to you that you were searching for?
Yeah. Well, I think the most important part for me is that what was immediately revealed was that I had this gap in my life from not having my father around.
Yeah.
Right. And even though I had a stepfather, after a while he wasn't around either, because I was now out of the house myself. And I didn't have that person to turn to and call on. So these markers in my life, people like that former boss, and there's a couple of other really respected men in my life that I'd turned to over time. I realized that they were critically important to me to get through it, but they weren't the answer. There's only one answer. Yeah. And it wasn't until I realized that the Lord had a lot more for me in life. He designed those things, allowed me to go through those trials and to find out what was missing in my own life, so that as He filled me with the things that were missing, that then I could become a better service to Him. Right? We talk about this in our business a lot, but pressure reveals cracks. Right? And when I was pressed to the point where those cracks weren't just cracks. I got broken open. And it wasn't until I was broken open and that He could pour into me. Yeah. Those moments were some of the most filling moments. There are things that I've written down in my journal, and everybody should write down in your journals, everybody. There are moments I wrote down things that I heard at that time that are exactly what my life looks like today, 17 years later. Wow. They're still were told to me in those moments. I'm like, wow, that was amazing. I got to write that down. I mean, when you hear those kinds of things, whether you hear them on a podcast or you hear them in church or you hear them from a business leader, write it down. Yeah. Because our brains can't remember all this stuff. Yep. And so write it down. And I think I look back on some of those things I wrote then, and oh my gosh, how life-giving it was then, to now look at my life today and say, this is exactly what was said to me 18 years ago. Yeah. Like, how's that possible? It's remarkable.
So here you are now, a man who's accepted Christ. It's been 17 years since that. God's blessed you with a great career, both in a business world and really a ministry career, touching lives. And yet I know you're still human. And so, like every human, we battle with things, fears, insecurities. What is something like that for you? A guy who seems to really honestly have it all. What are some struggles that you find that you have to bring to the Lord on a daily basis?
Yeah. Well, I got to back up for 1 second here first, because the story wouldn't be complete if I didn't tell you about my amazing wife. Right? My wife is simply the most important person in my life today. And she has brought me such comfort and joy. And she really does, because of the way she is, and she's just a remarkable person. She's incredibly independent and yet incredibly tender and wants to be close kind of all the time. And I love that. Right? It's such a beautiful thing because I know she can be on her own without me being right there, and she's perfectly confident and normal. In fact, she can carry her own without me really well, sometimes better. And yet she'd prefer to be right next to me, right? But I don't have to worry. It doesn't cross my mind that she might not be okay because she is so independent and okay. And so the reason I bring that up is that helps me allow me to be me. It helps allow me to think more about the joy that the Lord's put in me. And it frees me up to not be fearful about a lot of things. And it can be remarkable where I'll forget stuff for days. Yeah. And I'll be, hey, honey, did this? And she's like, I took care of it. I'm like, how did you know? Well, I just, I could tell you were busy or something like that. Yeah. And just stuff like that I don't even, might skip my mind, that might cause havoc in your life later on. Yep. I don't have to worry about those things. So some of the kind of daily or everyday pressures, my incredible wife has helped remove a lot of that stuff from my life because of the person she is, the amazing person she is. And so there's a beauty in that. Yeah, beauty that has partnership. Become part of who I am since we've been married, and that is one of the most remarkable gifts that I've ever recognized has been given to me. So that's important. Yep. But to kind of tackle the question head on, more so than the reason why it's not a tough question. But to tackle it that way, I would say the biggest concern for me still to this day, as much as I'd like to believe I'm fully healed of it, I'm not. I still have a bit of a fear of failure, right? And, the funny thing is I was reading a prayer of mine on the Bible app from like a year and a half ago the other day. And I was asking for the Lord to help me with my fear of failure and my fear of success. And I read it again. I read it a couple of times and I said, am I afraid of that? Like, where did that come from? And it really made me think again, what is that fear? What am I concerned about? Like, why is there fear at all? Right. And I think what it's the absence of the presence of God, because if the presence of God is there, fear can't be. At the same time, it feels to me like there's always moments where my will and my spirit might, skip a beat, might forget something. And there's a moment of weakness where I realize, where I ask the question, which is nothing more than unbelief, but I may ask the question, what if this doesn't happen? Yeah. What if he doesn't come through? What if those moments that I think we've all been in, and those are tough moments, because those are the moments when you've got to reach back down into that well of faith and say, hey, Lord, I need your help right here. Yeah. Like, why am I even questioning this right now? And yet, it's part of the human condition, right? Like, I can't help it sometimes. It's how I respond to it that I think has completely changed in the last, 15 years.
Has more success caused the fear of failure to become greater? Or with more success, have you found it easier to wrestle down that fear of failure?
I actually don't think the fear of either one is the issue. It's my response to it, right? Like if I encounter fear of any kind, I now know what my response is. And whether it's a fear of failure or a fear of success, those are those are worldly determinations anyway. Yeah. Right. It's not part of what my purpose in life is to worry about being fearful, being failure, or being a success. Yeah. I'm called to love on my family and the people around me. And when I typically encounter that fear of failure or fear of success, I do go back to the Lord and say, hey, wait a second. Why am I feeling like that? What am I doing here again? You want to remind me just to make sure? I'm pretty sure I know, but I need to hear it from you. Yeah. And ask that question and have that conversation, because if I don't ask that question and hear it from him, that I'm just drawing on what's left in me. And sometimes, we're depleted.
Yeah.
And I get depleted too.
Yeah.
Like anybody else.
Well, and what you've talked about, you've already highlighted, is the sort of spiritual disciplines that you have, that even now you're able to go back a year and a half ago, look at a prayer that you had written down, so you can remind yourself the journey you've been on. I think one of the things that's the challenge for most believers is we don't have those kind of disciplines, journaling, some kind of writing down, so that they create the very intentional mile markers in our life where we can go back. I mean, the Bible's full of monuments that in the Old Testament God wanted them to create to remember. They were pillars of remembrance to go, hey, this happened. Here's what God did. And so when we look at markers in our life and we take time to write them down, to remember them, so that when time goes on, we can look back and remind ourselves, here's where God was faithful in a very trying time of my life.
Yeah. 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 In fact, so much so that that's part of our family's journey every year. On Thanksgiving Day, we start a process that goes until Christmas Day. It's a little tradition we started about 6 or 7 years ago, where every day we're going to write something that we're thankful for. And then on Christmas Day, we're going to share them with each other. And we're going to pass it around at Christmas dinner. Let me see your list. Let me see your list.
That's a great idea.
And see what your thankfulness list looks like.
Yeah.
Right? Because, I think for me, I got to start there. I'm just grateful that I'm alive today. I remember how challenging and difficult life has been at so many times way back when. And so to have the blessing of being able to get to be a CEO in an amazing company, to get to be the men's pastor in the capacity that I am, it's a gift. And I'm grateful for it every day.
Okay, so I want to ask you a question about your time that you spent with men. This journey of meeting with all these men at Gateway Church, and now probably a couple thousand people that you've met one-on-one. And I was asking you just about your own sense of fear and what it is that you struggle with, and how do you lay that down, and what do you do? What have you found is a consistent, if there is a consistent theme among these men that you've seen, that they're struggling with, and how have you helped them work through those struggles?
Yeah. I would say the most predominant theme, which is not what you might hear from a lot of people, but the most predominant theme that I ran into were father wounds of some kind, right? And that there were people who were struggling and doing dumb things, but typically the root was not the dumb thing. The root was there was the father wound. And to really hone in on, why is that the case? It's a cultural failure, for our country, that I think you see less of in other countries. Now traveling around the world as much as I do, you just don't see it quite as much.
Interesting.
But the dramatic divorce rate in this country, even the drive to success, that a lot of people have, the sort of the force feeding of you have to do it this way, otherwise you're not good enough.
Yeah.
And I heard a lot of that, a lot of that from people who grew up in environments like that, and then that their dad was still around. They love their dad today, but they had this belief in them that if they didn't act a certain way, they were going to fail. And so that's a really harsh sort of wound.
Yeah.
And it's very behaviorally oriented.
Very conditional.
Right? Yeah.
Yep.
And that is, I don't think, and that's not biblical. Right?
Yeah.
So, and it's not necessarily loving. It's more the conditional sort of loving.
Yeah.
And that, unfortunately, when you're raised that way, you then turn around and treat your kids that way.
Yeah.
So it's generational unless you do something about it.
That's right.
And I feel like that was the one area that I really, every time that happened, I just wanted to get up and hug the guy, right? Still to this day, I feel like that. Because I know the feeling, and yet for some miraculous reason, I don't think like that myself, but I do feel like there's an opportunity for us to address that particular root of father wounds, and to help speak life and identity and affirmation into our men that could change the country. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it's maybe one of the biggest issues. We see it played out in a bunch of other, you see crime, you see, pornography, you see, failure in marriages, you see divorce rates, you see, this is the outgrowth of of a bunch of men who are not confident in who they are, right? It's an identity crisis that's gone on that when you meet with 2,214 men, then when you sit down with them and you hear that thousands of them have this issue, that's a pretty good sample size for the country.
Yeah.
and to say, and these are people that are actually trying to find out, is the Lord doing something in me or not? That's why they're sitting down with a pastor. Many of them have sat down with me because I was a CEO. And they say, well, you're going to understand what I've got going on. Can I just tell you what's going on in my business right now? And I say, like, yeah, but tell me about your wife first. And when they wouldn't, and they go right back to their business, say, oh,
yeah, I think
I see what's going on here.
I see a problem here.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, but that didn't come from her.
Right.
It's how he grew up.
Man.
And so that challenge, I think, is one that, we can do better at in the church. We can do better at in our country. We can do better at as men who walk this planet, and we can help the next generation realize that they're here for a good purpose. The men are here for a reason, and that reason is something that they should seek after and try to find, but it shouldn't be by someone else's set of rules.
Yeah.
Right.
It's amazing because you have such an incredible story of a mom, as you start out talking about, who really almost helped you almost not realize the brokenness of your home,
right?
Because she did such a phenomenal job. So, we have people watching or listening who come from broken homes, or a single mom who's going, how do I fill this gap that I can't fill, that is an absentee father? I'm just a mother. I can't do both. Well, you can love, you can bring joy, you can find your identity in Jesus so that you can bring that strength that you're only going to find through God into your home that will benefit your child. And I think when men might be listening or watching who find themselves leading their home, maybe having to somehow find the healing from their own brokenness, which is really only going to be found in Jesus.
Right.
And sometimes you need someone else to help you find Jesus in that, even though you have a relationship with Jesus. How to really fill that broken place in you. You need to talk to somebody else. But you have an opportunity today to make sure that what you're expressing to your children is not performance-based. It's not conditional love, but it's unconditional love. And I think a lot of fear that creeps into men when thinking about children is, well, I've got to motivate them. If they don't perform, then I'm going to raise some kind of weakling who's not going to be successful in life, and da-da-da. So I've got to sort of hang performance over them so that they know I will love them when they perform well. Mm-hmm. And we may not ever say it that way, but that's a lot of time the feeling. Yeah. And that's just not how God operates. And I think he's shown a successful formula, which is love unconditionally.
Well, and I think what that does is it unlocks who you really are.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the issue, is an identity crisis. And look, it's going on in our country right now. Right. I mean, social media has created all these different images that, if you're really young and you're wondering, you can find anything that you want on social media. And so if you then have to figure out what is my identity, with the whole gender idiocy that's happening even now, like the fact that there's this many questions about it is remarkable. And that is something that people are pouring into. People are seeking after, saying, well, maybe is no. And yet at the same time, what I think is so beautiful about what our Lord can do, and honestly, I've seen this with people of other faiths. It's not just it's just Christianity. People who are firmly rooted in their faith know who they are.
Yeah.
And if you know who you are, you live an authentic life. And you allow those impurities and iniquities that, David talks all about all through Psalms. You allow those things to get washed out, because authenticity cleanses you. Yep. And if you just allow yourself if you recognize, I'm born for something different than what some prescriptive model I saw on social media says, or what some article I read on some news station says. If I stay away from letting other people tell me who I'm supposed to be, and I allow the Lord to tell me, or if you're part of another faith, you allow your faith to drive the truth to you. If that's how you if that's how you've been raised, then go with that kind of authenticity. Stick to that. That's the thing that will help you grow. And it will help you when the pressure comes and the cracks are revealed. That's when the faith comes out.
Yep.
And if we can stick a little bit closer to those things, if we can stick with that with the men I meet, if I can stick to that in the business I get to run, then good things happen.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
life gets better.
Amen. Well, Chris, awesome conversation this week, man. Thank you. And
Thank you.
Just want to let you guys know we're going to have Chris back again next week, but Dad's going to step in and do the interview for next week's session. So you're going to want to tune back in. Thanks for joining us this week. Chris has been great. He's going to be great for our episode next week as well. Let me pray for you, and then we're going to go. God, thank you for your journey in all of us. Lord, what you are doing in our lives. I thank you for Chris Griffin, Lord, what you've done in his life and how you are using him in the marketplace and in the church. I pray, God, that what you've done in his life, as we've listened to that today, Lord, you would encourage and challenge all of us, Lord, to continue to grow in our relationship with you and do that by serving others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
God bless you.
Got to be cool, fool. You can make it happen, Captain, but remember, you got to be funky.